Welcome, geography students. Today we're going to get into some topics dealing with population policies, things that governments produce in order to change their population in one way or another, for several different reasons. Let's take a look. The first type of policy we're going to talk about today are anti-natal policies. These are going to be policies that discourage more births within the country. Anti, obviously, meaning against; natal, meaning birth or babies. And so anti-natal policies are policies that governments typically put in place in order to prevent or slow down the high birth rates that go on within a country. This is typically because resources are becoming more scarce, and therefore less babies are wanted in terms of number of children per family. And so these policies, as we're going to see in a minute, have that effect that reduces the overall population, therefore theoretically having more resources to go around. These on the other side of the fence are called pro-natal policies, and these are countries that have a either declining or a slow-growing population that wants to increase the number of babies being born or the average family size within the country, and therefore other reasons as well, which we'll get into later. But basically, governments want more babies being born in pro-natal policies. And the final type that we'll touch on are eugenic policies, meaning that one particular race or ethnic group is favored over another. The most famous example throughout history is in Nazi Germany with the Aryan race, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed babies, that Hitler wanted, rather ironically, considering he was neither. But these are the main ones. Let's take a look at some of the anti-natal policies. One of our case studies is going to be China, probably the most famous one, our anti-natalist policy, their one-child policy, which Mao Zedong is going to institute in 1979. Originally, when he took power in the 50s as the ruler of the Communist Party in China, it was believed that they needed to have more and more kids, and large families were a good thing. And over time, he realized that the resources were dwindling in China, and therefore he needed to reduce the overall population, which is why he instituted the one-child policy. Now, this made it to where families could only have one child in their family, which, unless you were a minority group. So the Han Chinese, which is the largest ethnic group in China, were the ones that were affected by this. If you were a minority group, you could have a few more with as long as you got the right permits and things like that. These policies were instituted, rather forcefully in different ways. As you can see on here, they did nice things like, made contraception and birth control more available, but there are some negative consequences as well. There are high abortion rates, especially for females in the population, which led to a heavy male population. We still see that to this day. If you take a look at China's population pyramid today, it's heavily skewed towards males for that reason. They had different types of enforcement of this as well. You can see here they even hired elderly within the population to spy on families to make sure that they are only having one child. So there's a lot of negative consequences of this fact. But you can see here how fast they were growing, 583 million in 53, and by 2010, 1.3 billion, which is a huge population, obviously the largest in the world, and reason why they instituted the policy. If you take a look at it here, you can see how their population really shifted and went through an unnatural stage 4. You can see that their population is now in a stationary phase. They're not quite in a decline yet, because remember we were looking at the top here compared to the bottom. But you can see that down here at the bottom there's a lot more boys than girls in the population, which is going to cause a lot more issues for that reason. And if you take a look here, we'll let it cycle back around, but here shows the shift that China started off with here, starting in stage 1 in 1950, and then that death rate slows, and you can see how it, by 1979, that stationary phase came very quickly. They almost skipped stage 3 and went from a stage 2 to a stage 4 because of that one-child policy. Another one I want to talk about is India. India is the second largest population and soon going to overtake China as the largest population in the world. And they went through some of the similar type of anti-natalist policies. In 1960, they first began these planned family arrangements. Certain people were forced to become sterile after they had 3 or more children. Men in the population were forced to have vasectomies in order to get that, and therefore they would not produce any more children. This was seen as a attack on their manhood, though, so it was not people skated by this policy, and so they ended up one of the interesting things they did was start offering guns to men as long as they had this procedure done to be sterilized, which is something that's a little bit different because we have a lot more freedom as far as guns, but in the country of India they don't have the same freedoms, and they also are having some problem with gangs in this particular region of India, and so that was a heavy incentive and allowed a lot more, as you can see here, to get that procedure done and reduce the birth rates. But now they are in most places they're just using advertising and education, and they believe those are the most effective means. Here's kind of the way it's kind of shaped. Here's the original one in 1950, and now we can see they are in a stage 3 as opposed to a stage 2 here. All right, finally, some pro-natalist policies. These are countries that are declining in population. Mostly in Europe and Japan. They have fallen below that 2.1 fertility rate, mostly because of education, women working and wanting to be in careers. They're having later marriages, and they're saying that a lot more family comes into, a lot more money comes into the family when they have careers and have less and less kids. And so this is leading to a lot of problems now where there's gender inequality. If they're only having 1 kid, they want to have males, and so they have selective births, similar to what you see in China, but more so on the genetic engineering side. We're seeing labor shortages is probably the main thing. Too many elderly and children compared to the number of people in the working class and the working age group. So they're not being able to support the elderly. And so one of the things they're going to start doing is offering incentives for parents to have more children. So we see in France, they pay people, the mothers to stay out of work for a year to have a child as long as it's their 3rd child. So they're providing incentives there. In Russia, they have a national day where they give them off of work in order to increase the birth rate, so to speak. And if you have a child 9 months later, you get a prize, and that varies in the country between money to cars, many different things that is trying to incentivize people to have more kids. Denmark gives you paid vacations in order to encourage having larger families. They feel like when young couples go on vacation, they're more likely to want to experience the world in terms of being a family more, and therefore more likely to have kids. And in the U.S. and most developed countries now, they have tax breaks. Basically, you pay less in taxes the more you have kids. And these are just incentives to have a growing population, which we can see in many places in Europe and Japan they're having a problem with right now. There are many other policies out there and incentives, but the idea for these pro-natalist policies is to increase the birth rates to make sure that these problems that we're seeing get solved, because a lack of labor is a huge problem that we're going to see in the future, and many more countries are going to go through this. Here's kind of Japan's population pyramid to kind of show you what's happening. You're going to see a large fill-up of elderly population and not as much in the working age. So anyway, that's kind of the pro-natalist, anti-natalist conundrum that government policies can be put in place to help solve.